Hey everybody, welcome to today's video, and this is going to pick up where we left off in the introduction to jQuery and then just give us a little bit of hands-on here. So I've uploaded this file to our course material folder. You can find it under basic jQuery intro.html. It's under the jQuery folder. Inside of here then is just a basic document. I do want to point out that again, I'm going to put everything in the head section as far as styling and then the JavaScript jQuery that we're going to work with, and I'm doing that just for this sample here, this demo, so that we have everything contained in one file and you're not having to bounce back and forth between multiple files here. This document, this page, if you open it up in your browser, you'll see that it's relatively straightforward. I'm going to have a handful of buttons here and a hyperlink at the top, and well, here I'll refresh it so that you can see what it will look like, and a handful of divs. And so what I want you to focus on with this, and what I'm going to focus on, is the jQuery syntax, as well as some events, callbacks, and function handlers or event handlers as well. So that's really what we're focusing on here with this video and with our introduction to jQuery. In the file then, two things that I want to point out here in the style section. All right, so I have these styles. You can see that these are classes, right? Recall that classes are defined with a period in front of them. And so if we want to apply a class to an element, then we have to use a class attribute on that element, and we'll do that here using JavaScript today, or jQuery today. Inside of here, in these first four classes, I've just simply defined some font sizes using the EM unit of measure, so 0.5, 1.0, 1.5, and 2.0. So what we'll use that for is the buttons that I have defined that have the pluses and the minuses. Those buttons themselves, then I'll just have it increasing and decreasing the font size. The last one that I have, the last class, okay, this is a selector. It has the hashtag in front of it, so that means that we're using the ID attribute of an element, and it's looking for an ID, an element with an ID attribute of many divs, and then it applies to any div that has that as a parent. So any div that has a parent that has an ID attribute of value of many divs will have these properties here. So all those little divs with the blue boxes, that's what you're seeing here. So just so that they can show up without any content inside of them, I've defined a width and a height, given them a background color, as well as changed their display to inline block. And so divs are a block level element, and we discussed those in some of those earlier lectures. That means that they have a break both before and after the element itself. And so changing that display property to inline block is what allows these to display. They maintain block level attributes, so we can define things like a width and a height, but they're next to each other. That is, they don't break. They don't have a break both before and after. Okay. We'll skip over the script tags for just a second. And then the last piece here is the actual elements inside of the body tag. So here's the hyperlink, and you'll notice that the target attribute is set to _blank. So when we define hyperlinks, we do the target attribute is how we define how that link is opened, whether it opens within that window, whether it opens a new window, whether it opens a new tab. This is how that attribute is how we define that. The href then is where that link goes to, and then this is the title that is displayed to the user. And so this is how you can get a disconnect between what somebody sees when they click and what they actually click on, is that the href attribute is what defines the URL that goes to. Handful of buttons here, so you can see that all these buttons, there's only one of them that I've defined the on-click event, and so we'll define the on-click event and what that on-click event's going to do in the JavaScript. The last thing then is a section with a paragraph. We've got some filler text there, the lorem ipsum style text, and then there's our divs. So we have our section with that ID attribute of many divs, and all the divs that are now that have this element as a parent, and these guys are all siblings to each other. And so that's how that selector is being applied to these divs, making them all that square blue box. Okay, here's our input type button. ID attribute of button hide divs and the value of hide divs. And again, you'll notice that I did not define the on-click attribute here because we'll handle that with the jQuery. Okay, so to move on to the jQuery then, it looks like there's a lot of code here, but there really isn't. And some of the stuff that's commented out, we'll get to that here as I go through some of the examples. First thing is, in order to include jQuery, we talked about in the last video, there's a couple of ways you can do that. This is an example of linking to a CDN, or content delivery network, and so you have in your script tag a source attribute, and you point it to that external JavaScript file. So in this case, this links to jquery.min.js that's hosted at ajax.googleapis.com. And so if you're interested in getting jQuery, or there's a lot of other libraries that do this via CDN. You just have to search for how do you get those delivered through a CDN. Usually they come back in top results. Google's a big supporter of hosting things through their CDN, through their delivery network, as you can see here. Let's see, jquery.min.js. Just want to point out that if you open this file up, it'll be very hard for you to read. It's valid syntax, the browser understands that, but the min means that it's been minified, and that is that there is a process, a tool that the authors use in order to try to condense that file, make it smaller, and that's to help with performance and bandwidth and things. So if you want to look at the original source code, then you have to find that non-minified version of jQuery. Typically, when you go into a production environment, that means you want your site out there on the internet available to everybody. That's typically when you start using minified things, because you're trying to make those files that your clients have to download as small as possible, and that minification process helps with that. Inside of our script tag, then, you'll see that I'm going to define a couple of variables, one array, and then one variable called index, and we'll get back to those in a little bit. The first thing that I want to talk about here is document ready event. And again, this is something that we introduced in the last video, and that is that we're calling this function, and you'll notice that all my code is inside of this function here, right? Because we have a function defined with the curly bracket, and everything that we're going to do is inside of here. What this function is doing then is it's waiting for the browser to trigger the DOM ready event. And once the DOM is ready, it's important we wait for that DOM to be ready, because we don't want to start accessing these elements. You can see everything I do in here is I'm using that selector via jQuery to select elements and then define actions, define click events, or define, pretty much all of these are click events. And so if I try to do this before the DOM is ready, then oftentimes this will fail. All right, so it's very important that we do that. That's what this function, that's the purpose of this function. When we're looking at, we're going to look at this opening, kind of the opening statement here for document ready. This has to be closed. And so if we scroll down to the bottom of our script tag, you'll see that it ends with a curly bracket, a right parentheses, and then a semicolon. This is where, especially as you start to get a lot of code, it becomes very important to keep your indentation correct, because that indentation then allows us, through tools like Sublime Text that highlight these brackets for us. Not only did they, without those, make it easier to read, but with those it makes it even easier. And so if we weren't sure, because you can see here that we have a couple of these statements, these lines that are exactly the same. If we weren't sure, these lines will definitely help line up what we're looking at. So curly bracket, parenthesis, right? That's where those closing tags are coming from. So if I were to close it up here, I'd have curly bracket, parentheses, and a semicolon, because that is still a single statement, right? We're going to still execute that as a single statement. So that's why those are down there at the end. Again, the jQuery syntax and even the syntax you'll use in JavaScript, just regular JavaScript, it takes just a little bit to get used to. So definitely let me know if you have any questions on that. All right, so there we've got our document ready. So what we'll do here, and what you'll see here, is that when we load the page, none of this JavaScript will execute until the DOM is ready. That DOM event fires, the onload event fires, in which case then it'll call this function. Inside of this function, I've done several things. The first thing that we're going to focus on is that I've created this, we'll focus on this first little block here. What I'm doing then is I have a selector for an anchor tag, and the action is to define the click event. And so in jQuery, this dot click is like defining the on click attribute of that element. So I say anchor tag dot click. So when everybody clicks on that link, then here is a function that I want to call. Function, it has one argument, event, which is the value that gets passed to this function when that event is called. And then, so this is the code that's going to execute here. Alert, you clicked me. Okay, this would be very similar. Let's say that we define a function like we've talked about. I'll just call it something simple like alert click. And inside of here, I'll just define a simple thing like that. Right. So we could also, just so hopefully this makes the syntax here a little bit more clear as far as the difference between the two. Right, we could also do something like that. Okay, so we'll come back to those here in just a minute. I want to go through this example first. All right, so click event, this is the function that we're going to call. And this is how I've defined that function. So what we'll do then is I'll open up this page in a browser. I'll make sure to refresh it so that all my changes are there. When we start working with JavaScript, when I start working with JavaScript, I oftentimes like to have the console tab open. That way I can see some of these error messages I don't really need right now. But that way I can see errors, especially errors in the JavaScript, because they'll be logged to the console. So go ahead and refresh that. And now if I click on this link, you'll see that my alert popped up. You clicked me, and the default behavior of the hyperlink is followed. That is that when you click on a hyperlink, it opens that URL, which was a link to usd.edu. Okay, so you clicked me. Sometimes you want to prevent that default behavior, and I talked about that in the last video. And so we have this event object that's passed to this function when that event triggers. And so we can access that property on that element, on that object, event.preventDefault. And what that will do then is it'll allow us to call our custom code, and then this will prevent the default behavior from happening. So now if I make that change, and I go back to the page and refresh, what you'll see when we click this link is that the alert pops up. I can click OK to dismiss it, but it doesn't open a new tab with the window to usd.edu. I prevented the default behavior of that button click from happening. Right, so that isn't necessarily a great example, and that it's not something that I typically do, but just be aware that it is possible, so that you can at times, when you start working with callbacks and events, and the event handlers, you can tell that particular object, that particular event, to prevent doing whatever it does by default. Okay, I did want to try and let's do this. Let's comment this out, and we'll just see if that other method that I mentioned here works. That is that, I guess I got to do this actually. All right, so I'll just redefine that click event, and we'll say alert click. All right, so we'll save that. I'll refresh the page. Nope. Okay, so we can also define it this way, and that we can say that if we have a click event, this is the function that we want to call, which is alert click. That is defined down here in more of the standard way in which we define functions, and inside of here I simply have an alert box. And so make that modification, and we can save that page, of course reload it, and click the button, and you'll see you clicked me too, and then we have the default behavior because I didn't attempt to prevent the default. All right, let's see. So I'll get rid of this. Okay, so moving on, the next thing that I want to take a look at then is what happens when we click this Hide Divs button. And what you'll see here is that when you click Hide Divs, of course, it's going to hide the divs. But I've got, again, those alert boxes set up to kind of pop up here as this demo goes. So we call Hide Divs, and then we get an alert box for hidden. Right, and then another alert box, and we get several more. And in fact, we get an alert box for each one of the divs that we hid. And so why did that happen? Well, if we go in here and we look at that next little section of code, what you'll see is that I have a jQuery statement here. I have the selector, which is selecting based off of the ID attribute. So hashtag button hide divs. If we go down here and look at the code, we'll find that there's that button with an ID attribute of button hide divs. Going back up then, what I also did was the action is click. And inside of click, because this is a function, I can define whatever I want. I can have as many statements as I want here, things that I want to have execute. So jQuery has a hide function. And now I have another jQuery statement in which I have a selector that selects anything, every div that has a parent element that has an ID attribute of many divs. And if we go back and take a look at that code, you can see that there are multiple divs here that have a parent element that has an ID attribute value set to many divs. And so what that statement is doing right here then is it's returning a collection of objects, right? Before, in that last example, we had only one object. And so we set the click event for that hyperlink and it returned, that selector returned a single object. With this one, this selects an entire collection. And so it selects all those objects, and then for the action, it applies, it hides each one of them. The hide function, then, we have the ability to set the delay. And so in this case, that first argument is in milliseconds. There is 1,000 milliseconds to a second. So 1,000, a value of 1,000 means 1 second. And in here, I can define another function. And so what happens is, this is the callback function for after those divs are hidden. And so how this is going to work then is we're simply setting the click event for that button. When that button is clicked, it selects these div elements and hides them. When all the divs are hidden, this function has a callback that pops that alert box. And probably an easier thing to do would be to use console.log because it's a little less obtrusive as far as it goes for our debugging purposes here. But that's okay. Okay. So that's why we got all of those boxes to pop, because with each item in this collection, with each div that was selected, we applied the hide. We hid that, and for each one that was hidden, the callback was to call this code. And so that's why that alert box popped up however many times, however many number of divs there are. Okay, we could also add additional code and have additional things execute. So we have hide, we also have show. And so what this will do now is it'll hide all of them. Let's just get rid of the pop of the alert box and let's just do a console.log. Right, and then it'll show them. So it'll select those same divs and then call the show function, and it'll show them with a 1,000 with a 1 second delay. So from the time that it begins to hide, from the time that it is hidden to the time that it is shown takes a second. All right, it's just how long the animation or how quickly that animation goes. All right, so we'll run our function here. We've got the console open. So as soon as these are closed, we should see some output, and then we should see them open. And there we go. And it looks like it only logged at one time. But with the developer tools, at least with Firefox, you have to look at over here is that when the console detects the same exact output being logged or the same output to the log, it groups them together. All right, so you can see here that this has actually generated 9 repeats, so there are 9 divs on this page. All right, so that worked. We hid them, and then we called another function to show them. And so we're working with jQuery. Okay, again, this is the selector, much like we write selectors in CSS. And this is the action. So we selected this button, and we defined what happens when somebody clicks it. We selected these divs, and we hid them. Right? We called this code as a result of when this button was clicked. And then the same thing after hide. This provides us the ability to define a callback. So once those elements are hidden, then we select those same divs again, and we call show. All right, the last thing that we're going to look at here is just these last couple of functions that allow us to, or they're going to allow us to change the font size of the page by removing and then adding those classes, those original 4 classes, those first 4 classes that we talked about at the beginning of the video here. If I refresh the page, and I'm going to make this console just a little bit smaller here, And I have these two buttons, so we can do plus, and then minus and minus, and minus, whatever. So we click these two buttons, and it changes the font size. It changes those fonts, the font size, by the class. And so if you look right here in our developer tools, as I click that button, you can see that not only did the value of that class attribute change, but it even highlighted it, flashed for a second. And that's actually kind of an important thing. It's a very helpful thing, in that when you're dealing with pages and development and a lot of client-side dynamic type of functionality, the developer tools highlight elements as they're being changed in real time. And I find that to be kind of a handy feature. All right, so there we go. As we're iterating through, we're changing the font size, and we're seeing that being done through the jQuery, the JavaScript, and that we're removing class, the previous class, and we're applying a new one. And that new class then changes the font size because of the font size property that's set in that class. All right, so how's that being done? Well, I have a button decrease. All right, so we have a selector here. The action is that whenever somebody clicks on that, I defined a function, and inside of that function, I call remove class and then add class. And so this selects the button to define the click event, and then inside of that click event, I have another selector that selects it selects a paragraph tag that is the child of a section. If we go down and look at the HTML, you'll see that I only have one of those defined in this document, a paragraph tag with a parent section. And it first calls remove class, and then it calls add class. And the remove class then removes all classes. So if there's an attribute, a class attribute defined on the element, it removes all the classes. If there is multiple classes defined, then this can do one of two things. If you call it without any arguments, it removes all the classes, all those class attributes. If it has multiple classes, then you can define what class you want to remove. I could say something like font small. And that would remove that particular class if the class has multiple classes defined. So that's kind of handy. For this demo, though, all I want to do, or I try to simplify it a little bit just to get through the demo, is that I'll have it remove the classes, and then it's going to add a class. So just like removing it removes that element, adding it then does the same. It adds, if there is no class attribute defined, it adds that attribute with that class. If there is already a class attribute defined with classes in it, this just adds that class to that existing list. For the argument here, this is a string value. And so we previously looked at the beginning here, that I have this array called text sizes, and then each array has 4 elements, or this array has 4 elements, and each value then is a string that represents those classes. So font small, font medium, font large, font XL. And just to go back and look at those classes, you can see that those do indeed match up. And so all I'm doing then is that as the user clicks, to allow them to go through, essentially walk through that array and go from the smallest to the largest, or the largest to the smallest, or any incremental step in between, then what I'm doing is I'm changing this index variable, which I have defined as 1 initially. So when this page loads, these are global variables. The array is initialized with 4 elements with those values, and this index variable has a default value set to 1. And so I'm just with each of these functions, right? We're going to increase and decrease. We're going to make the font larger and then smaller. This index, because this is a decrease, it decreases the counter, and then it adds the class based off of that index. So it starts at 1, this decrements it to 0, so it uses 0 as an index into the array text sizes. And so if that index is 0, then that gets us the first element, which is font small. Okay, button increase then does just the opposite. It increases the index counter, but then it does the opposite to the counter, but it does the same thing as far as it removes classes, and then it adds the class using that index counter to access that particular element of the array. All right, so we can go back and take a look at that, refresh the page, and subtract, add, and you can see that it works. Now, of course, if you're looking at that and wondering, well, what happens if I keep clicking decrease? Well, then it's going to keep decrementing until it's using that value that's out of the bounds of the array, and that would in fact cause us some issues. And so there's things that we can do, some simple things we can do to help check for that, because we never want that index. The index in an array is never a negative value, and so we can add a simple check to say that if the index is greater than 0, then go ahead and decrement, right? As soon as it's equal to 0, we want to stop decrementing, so that each time the user clicks the button, once that index value is 0, we stop decrementing. It just stays at 0. And so we can do that, make that change, make that small change by adding that if statement, come back to our code, and then no matter how many times we click it, the font essentially stops changing, right? And we could do more. When we could certainly add this whole statement into the if statement if we wanted to. We can do something very similar with the increase function. That is that once we go above 4, then we don't want to go any higher. So as long as the index is less than length minus 1, because the length of that array is going to be 4, and so we have index 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, then as long as it's less than that, then we're fine. So as long as it's less than 3, we can add one more to it, because if it's 2, it's less than 3, we'll add 3. As soon as it's no longer less than 2, that means it's 3, we stop incrementing that index. All right, so again, make that small change, refresh the page, and now we can go in both directions. And once we've reached that, the array limit, the last class that we have defined for font size, we can't go any further. Right. So we just add some simple bounds checking to make sure that our program works relatively safely. Okay. Next thing that you can do, or the last thing here that I really want to talk about, is the fact that this code is starting to be repetitive, and that's one of the things that you do need to spend some time, or something that you'll start to pay more attention to with the more code that you write, is that as you start to see your code become repetitive, then those are indications that you can maybe pull those out and make a function, or better organize your code to make it less repetitive. A lot of developers go through this process, especially as they're learning. And pretty much any developer can do it. Take some code that you wrote and come back and look at it 6 months from now or 12 months from now and refactor it. Look at it and see how you can make it better. And oftentimes you've learned stuff over the years, over that time frame, that allows you to make your code more efficient. So as you're just getting into development, no matter what language it's in, looking for that repetition can oftentimes lead you down the path to make your code a little bit more efficient. And so this is an example in that we have the exact same thing happening in two different functions, where we're moving the class and adding the class. And so what we can do is I'm going to comment those out just so you can see what the changes that we're making. But I can define a function, which I did, called change class. Change class, then, what is the only difference between these two? Well, it's the element that we're selecting and the value of the class that we're adding. And so I created a function called change class that takes two arguments. That is the object that we want to select, the DOM nodes we want to select, and then the class that we want to apply. And so that class then is very simple. It's those two arguments, the selector and the class name, and then it just repeats. So because this is an argument to this function, I can use the value of that argument as the selector, because it's going to be a string, and use that selector value then to remove class, just like we did previously. Use that same selector to add class, and then use the value of that second argument, which is our class name. And so now I can get rid of those two lines of code and make this just a little bit more efficient. Right? And if I make those changes, save the page, and you'll see that we have the exact same functionality now. All right, the last ones here I'll leave for you to kind of experiment with if you would like. This is a way to maybe a slightly more efficient way and to decrease the font size, and then you could implement something very similar to increase it. That is that if we use this, so we have some jQuery right here. We have our selector that gets that paragraph, and once we have that object, we can use the CSS property to access that font size attribute. The font size then, this will return right here that font size. And so since it returns that value by default, even though it's a numeric value, it treats it as a string. And so we can then pass that to a parse function so that we can do something mathematical to it. So we can take whatever that value is and subtract 2 from it. So if it's 14, we can subtract 2 and make it 12. If it's 12, we can subtract 2 and make it 10. So that allows us then to, not based off of class, but based off of current property settings, in this case, decrease the font size. Right? We can set some bounds checking, just like we did previous. If the adjusted font is greater than 10, then go ahead and apply the new font size. That is, we got the current font size, then we subtracted 2, and we set that equal to this variable here. So as long as that's greater than 10, go ahead and apply it. If it's not greater than 10, then we don't want to go any smaller. And so we added some simple bounds checking. We could do the same thing and do it in the opposite direction. And instead of subtracting 2, adding 2 to it. And so it's just a slightly different way to do that. So take some time and study the code a little bit. Make sure that it makes sense, that you understand what is happening here. If it doesn't, then spend a little bit of time. Pull some of the pieces out and call individual functions and log things to the console.log to see what values it's returning. These functions are returning and the selectors are returning. So that you can see what's going on. And then definitely let me know if you're having any issues or if something here isn't clicking. So that's our intro to jQuery, and I think that's all I've got. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's all I got, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Thanks.